So George Osborne will make his annual autumn statement on Thursday with the economic winds at his back. That'll be a new experience for the Chancellor, whose previous updates to Parliament have taken place against a backdrop of stubbornly stalled growth. Yet even while claiming credit for the recovery, he faces a tricky challenge to address concern over falling living standards and make clear that the public finances are still far from fixed. I'm joined by the FT's political editor, George Parker, and economics editor, Chris Giles, to discuss what he's likely to say. Chris, let's start with you. There's growing optimism over UK growth. Some think that the UK could be the best performing developed economy over the next few years. How bullish do you expect the Chancellor to be on Thursday?
I think he's going to strike a note of sort of cautious optimism. Caution because he doesn't want anyone to think that it's just easy from now on, and then why vote Conservative if it's just easy. But optimism in that the forecasts are going to see the largest upgrade since the millennium, and pretty much 20 years or so. So we're going to see growth being revised up for this year, nearly 1 percentage point, and maybe a similar amount next year. These are very, very large increases in optimism for the economy as a whole.
But what about the public finances? Osborne has really staked his credibility on returning them to health. Does this growth mean that we're coming closer to the end of austerity?
Well, the very simple thing you can say is that with faster growth you get more rapid tax receipts and better revenues. And so the public finances will look better. But look at this chart here. This is the actual thing that matters for the Chancellor is the underlying or cyclically adjusted surplus, and when that gets back to balance. That's what he's targeting. And the trouble is that just faster growth now doesn't mean that you necessarily get faster growth in the future. So what will happen quite likely is we'll see the headline rates of borrowing falling into the future, but actually this cyclically adjusted current surplus, which is the target measure, looking very similar to the budget. I'm told that it's going to be on a knife edge, whether it's even better than the 2013 budget at all.
So a lot of tough work still ahead for the Chancellor. George, how does he turn this into a compelling political message?
Well, I think the difficult thing for George Osborne here is to temper his natural exuberance, I think, and about the increasingly optimistic forecast, because as Chris was saying, the political message in the next election has to be the job's half done, don't turn back. So I think the question of the political narrative, it's about that sort of stick to the path. It's a tough path, and I think that's why he will eschew the temptation for any kind of giveaways in this budget, give or take maybe $1 billion here, $2 billion there, because the fact of the matter is not only are the headline deficit numbers still huge, we're talking about a headline deficit of 120 billion, possibly going down to 105 or 110, but so the economics don't make sense of any sort of giveaway now. But the politics don't look good either, because we're still 18 months out from a general election. If there is any money sloshing around in the coffers, you expect them to be dipping into the coffers sometime nearer to the election. So I think it's very much a steady as she goes message. And I think Tory MPs have been briefed to expect, frankly, a rather boring autumn statement, and I think they quite welcome that.
The recovery seems to almost have liberated Labour to shift focus from austerity to living standards. It's a dilemma for Osborne. How much does he get drawn into that territory on Thursday?
Well, Ed Miliband's speech on energy prices, his promise to freeze energy prices back at the Labour conference in September, has been an enormous success. It's dominated the political agenda for the last 2 months. And George Osborne has been saying that we mustn't be dragged onto Labour's terrain. We must stick to the big macro message, the economy growing, jobs being created. But every week, we've seen the government, particularly David Cameron, being drawn more and more onto Labour's chosen terrain. So this is George Osborne's big week to try and grab back the political agenda back onto his own preferred territory, which is all about the sort of government's tough stewardship of the economy and away from that cost of living agenda. But having said that, they also know they need to neutralise what Labour have been saying. So we've got this big package on energy prices we know about. And there's also been other stuff about mobile phone charges, water charges, railway fares and all the rest of it. They know that the cost of living is a pertinent message which is cutting through for Labour.
And Chris, what's your take on the living standards debate? I mean, Labour have found fertile territory here. That suggests that there is a real economic issue underlying it.
They have found fertile territory, and if we look at this chart, I think it explains why. You see with the red line what's happened to GDP, including forecasts going into the future, and then the blue line is the middle household incomes after taxation. And you see that about a decade ago, these two lines moved apart. So households haven't seen any sort of rise in their living standards for about a decade, and they've been falling recently. So you can see why people are very, very concerned about living standards, even though the big macro indicators, GDP, has been rising. And so this is the real sort of crux of where the economics and the politics comes together. And there's a Treasury briefing paper I've seen just over the last couple of days, which shows how worried the Treasury are about this divergence, because they have explained away why this is happening. And they try to pin this rather much on Labour. They're saying the reason for this opening gap, going back to the early part of this millennium, is essentially things like the employers' national insurance rise and pension contribution increases, so that companies have been paying for their labour costs just as much as GDP, and that's kept in line. It just hasn't gone into people's pay packets.
Chris, George, thanks very much for joining us. Join us back on ft.com on Thursday for full coverage of the autumn statement.